you to write this intriguing book?
Okay. I'm originally from Brooklyn, New York. I've lived in Northampton for more than 20 years now. Most of us don't know our African American history, and at the time that was especially true, but it still is true today. And so I thought, gee, I think that I can teach something on this subject. My family is interracial, and I decided to start a course called Let's Talk About Race. What we talked about in class was the mundane aspects of racism, and we used the historical aspects of racism as a backdrop to people's immediate experiences of racism, whether they had participated in it or whether or not they were oppressed and victimized by it. So the point was to actually have an area in which people could be at ease with discussing the truth about the violence of racism. I happen to consider racism murder. I have always considered it murder. It diminishes the quality of life for people of color, and it has always done that. And so I've always considered it an act of violence. So why the violence, and how many layers of violence, and how does that get expressed? Well, it does through systemic, structural, blatant, subtle racism, a variety of different ways. Who has cared about it? Not too many people. Many people have not cared, with the exception of people of color. So one of the reasons why I designed the course was to have white people get more comfortable discussing this tremendous omission of their humanitarian effort, because many white people consider themselves humanitarians. And I thought, let's see how can you match that ideal with reality when we're talking about racism specifically, because the problem with racism is that white privilege endows us with certain ways and manners and forms of behavior and certain kinds of security system that people of color don't experience. And then we needed to discuss systemic white privilege and how that affects us, and what can we do? We cannot change the color of our skin. We are still going to be benefiting no matter what we think or how we feel. Somehow or other, we are in that box where we are benefiting just by virtue of our color. So in a way, we need to discuss, so how do we cope with that? That means that's going to require some other kind of coping mechanism when we become really conscious of it. And through that consciousness, when we start to make decisions that we need to make for ourselves, because in our environment, we're not going to find other people who've made those decisions that we are going to be needing to make. I have found a lot of younger students were very frightened when they looked, white students were very frightened when they looked at the general climate of the country and thought, my aunt didn't start out a racist, but she ended up one. My mother didn't think she was, but she is. And then what is racism really, and what's going to happen to me then? If it's that powerful that these people think they're not and they are, or they thought they wouldn't become one, but now they're justifying stereotypes and prejudices, what's going to happen to me? Because I'm only 21 and 22, and I don't want that. I don't want that for me. So what's happened? And so in class we would discuss that. And develop skills. Learn how to use the racial equality muscle is what I refer to it as, using the racial equality muscle. You do that through the dialogue. You do it through stepping up. You do it through acknowledging. You can do it through writing. You can do it through your choice of relationships. You can do it through your choice of intimate relationships. You do it through the necessary cross-cultural communication in which you are learning, I know better than the next person.
Exactly.
So, and I do think that institutions are responsible for that. Of course they're responsible for that. And so that was the point of my work, and the book has a writing interval in the book with questions, so you can answer these specific questions for you, so you can go through this process of transformation. And it has many of the students' quotes and work in the book.
Just curious as to what your feeling is as we go through now with a transformation in our political system, and the climate is heightening with race and tension.
Absolutely, yes.
Just wanted to hear your
Thank you,
thoughts.
thank you. I'll be happy to answer that question. I also want to add that I work with the National Organization for Women on their Combating Racism Committee, and I actually want to give a shout out to Joycelyn Morris, who's an amazing woman who happens to be black, who's incredibly important to me and has promoted my work, and I want to thank her. I think things are absolutely devastating now, absolutely exasperating. I have a second book coming out in a couple of months called Protocol, Welcome to Paradise, Watch Your Step. I started it 3 years ago. It was specifically to interview African American men who live in Northampton, Massachusetts, and the racism that they've been subjected to there. And then continuing to explain sundown towns. And it has many African American athletes and educators and psychologists who in the last 250 years are talking about their experience of being black in this country and how absolutely petrifying it is. So in answer to your question, what has happened now is an incredible hostility and distrust, even of me among blacks, because in a way I assert myself in a way which takes them by surprise, and then often, and we are talking stereotypes now, so this is generic, and there are times when within context it can be individual, and there are times when it has to be a more generic answer to this kind of a question, so I'm going for the more generic. But there's been too much trauma. There's been too much trauma in black culture. Too much post-traumatic stress, which again, we didn't expect this reversal of fortune. We really didn't quite respect it. So no one was prepared to deal. And since institutions weren't really dealing with racism anyway, they definitely weren't going to be dealing with the escalation of it. That was never going to happen.
Right.
So that was a humongous disappointment. That was just, and also not just a disappointment, that means more of your survival stuff is going to kick in, and more distrust and more fear, and with good reason. So now it's become harder and harder to trust white people. This is my interpretation, and I'm white, and that's what I'm saying. I remember in the 70s, we were all excited. My children are black, and we were thrilled in our circle in Brooklyn, for the word diversity. I found it's been watered down. It's been whited out. I call those things whited out. And so we were kind of enthused that the exposure, integration, the caring about it politically, there's certain laws changed. Music definitely influenced the fantasy that racism was not going to be here to stay. But I think part of what we learned from that experience is exposure and integration does not make for an integrated psyche. The problem is of the mind. The problem is psychological. Racism is psychological. And so therefore, exposure, even in an integrated environment, doesn't mean people even talking to one another, let alone feeling safe with one another.
Right.
So the problem is then stereotypes. How did stereotypes come to be? Which particular stereotypes were enforced in your environment? Which ones are you most comfortable with? Hey, I don't see a lot of people that uncomfortable with their stereotypes. I don't see it, with their prejudices. I don't see that. That's a comfort zone. It's a comfort zone that unfortunately is real distortion. It's a real distorted focus on reality, because it's a comfort zone that every culture relies upon. Every culture relies upon some level of their own comfort zone, because they get it. They get what it is to be who they are and be of their culture. And somehow or other that has to be distilled. Somehow or other we can't rely on that as a safety net, because if we do, no matter how together we get cross-culturally, we're going to go back to our own. And we go, that person is crazy. What happened? You know what I mean? And then you know what goes with that? Your interest, your motivation, the trust. There's no trust. And in addition, I wanted to say that regarding talking about race, people are resistant to talking about race if their lives do not depend upon it. And at this point in time, and for a very, very long time, people of color's lives have depended upon it. When I was raising my children of color, we actually did role-playing and preparation for going outside, for going on the subway. What happens if somebody accuses you? What do you do? So the assumption was never that you would rebel or fight back. It was that you would use your thinking. You would think first, and then you would call us, their father or I, at the first opportunity, or ask that we be called. And this is before cell phones, so it wasn't quite as easy right now as it is today. And but we had that preparation. It's a life-saving skill. It's an absolute necessity. And many authors and many people refer to it now as the talk. You had that talk.
Yeah.
If you're of color, You got to watch your back. And we're going to show you how to do that and how to be prepared, even if you're 7, 8, 9, 10. And so people of color that I know, and these women had mentioned that to me, when another white person said, people don't want to talk about race, we don't want to talk about race. And they said, what do you mean you don't want to talk about race? We do. We want to talk about race because our lives depend upon talking about
That's
race.
right.
If we don't talk. And so later, for whether or not race is a social construction or not, later for whether or not there's only one race, the human race,
Right.
later for that. As soon as white supremacy is dismantled in this country and we no longer have to worry about racism, that's when I feel at liberty to go, you're right, there's no such thing as racism. There's only one race, human race. Till then, till that moment takes place, this is what I'm talking about.
And Kaolin, where can we find out more about you and your books online?
Yes, I have a website. It is www.ltar.biz. I am also on Facebook, and my book is sold on Amazon and all the local indie bookstores and Barnes & Noble, all over the place.